Hello, everybody. It's really good to see you in person. Welcome to the Westmont Downtown Lecture Series, Conversations About Things That Matter. I'm Bobby Kinnear, member of the Westmont Foundation Board. It is the Westmont Foundation Board that sponsors the Westmont Downtown Lecture Series, which began in October 2005. Remember, Steve? 16 years ago. The series highlights important topics of the day, and the most amazing Westmont faculty brings the information to you. Though we did not meet in person last year, Westmont Downtown continued with fine Zoom programs. Today, we are delighted to hold this person-to-person program in this lovely Westmont outdoor patio in the Grayson Building. This series is a gift to our community. It's a gift to you. The goal is for those who attend is to enjoy meaningful, fundamental, and lively conversations. Please do not be shy and do ask many of your questions to our fine speaker. Now, I take great pleasure in introducing to you Professor Rick Iflin, who will introduce our speaker, Ronald See. Rick is the interim provost and dean of faculty at Westmont. In addition, he is the director of the Eaton Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Westmont. Rick graduated from Westmont, earned an MBA at the University of Kentucky and a Master of Studies in International Law at Oxford University. Thank you, Professor Iflin.
Well, thank you, Bobby. I get the pleasure of actually introducing you to two people today. I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Ron See in just a moment. But before I do that, I would like Dr. Rick Ostrander to stand up. He's right there. Rick just joined us, and he is the executive director of Westmont Downtown. So we have a building right across the street. We have this building, which we've not yet fit up, and he will be in charge of programs here and in off-campus programs that we have throughout the city and up in San Francisco and really throughout the world. So just wanted to welcome Rick here, and I wanted you to see his face so that if you are looking for programs downtown or you see him roaming around, you'll know who he is. Glad to have you here, Rick. Well, let me introduce you to I want to introduce you to a good friend of mine, Dr. Ronald See. Ron is a great scholar. He's a great person. He's a great friend, and I think you're going to enjoy the talk that he gives. What I love about what he does is he lets data speak, and data ends up being very stubborn, like facts. And so he loves to do research, and he loves to have the number and the data just tell a story. And so I think what he's going to do today, I've not heard this, but I think what he's going to do is tell us what the data says and share with us some information that we might not always get. And so we look forward to that, Ron. Ron studied at the University of California, Berkeley, where he got his BA in psychology. He also studied in Germany and speaks German. And then when he went, I guess he was done with Cal, so he came back to Southern California, and he got his MA and his PhD at UCLA. And he did that in psychobiology. And I kind of think I know what that is, but I'm not exactly sure that I know what that is. I know that he also spends a lot of time in neuroscience, and he spends a lot of time in psychopharmacology, and he's looking at really interesting things that are happening to the body and to the mind. He also studies addiction, and so an interesting time to be in the middle of COVID, where we have all changed our lives in some way, shape, or form, and we all are even developing new coping mechanisms, and sometimes that ends up being pharmaceuticals. So Ron, welcome. We're glad that you're here. Prior to being here, he was at Washington State. He's been a visiting professor internationally in two different places. He's looking to go international again on his sabbatical break this next year. So, yeah, please join me in welcoming Ron See.
Well, thank you so much, Rick, and thanks to the Foundation for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure to be the inaugural speaker in this beautiful space, and I've already decided I'm going to talk to the president about moving the psychology department downtown. So, Rick said I'm driven by data. We're actually just going to watch Up in Smoke by Cheech and Chong. So, no, just kidding. When I was asked to do a talk at Westmont downtown, I thought about what would I like to talk about, and I have done, as Rick mentioned, Dr. Iflin mentioned, research for many years in the neurobiology of drug addiction. And so one of the areas that I thought, being on the Central Coast and in the times we live in, the topic of cannabis would be a very good one to tackle in a public forum like this. So what I won't be talking about is the problems with the smells in your neighborhood in Carpinteria. I won't be talking about, why we have so many shops opening all over the county to sell cannabis products. Or the pros and cons of legislation. Okay, we can talk about that in Q&A, but that's not part of my talk. So what I will be talking about, though, as part of my overview of all of this, I want to start with some historical perspective. As one of my other interests is a historian. I actually teach a history and systems of psychology course, and just really have enjoyed being at Westmont and engaging in historical perspective. So I'm going to give you a little historical perspective. Talk about the current trends in cannabis use. This is important to see where are we heading. And then I'm going to get into neuroscience. I'm a neuro guy, brain guy, right? So I want to tell you a little about the neurochemistry of the constituents in the cannabis plant called cannabinoids. You'll learn a lot about cannabinoids tonight. I'm going to talk a little about therapeutic effects. What are the benefits that come from cannabis? And there are some. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to move into cannabis impacts on the brain and mental health. And that's really where I'm going to kind of dig a little deeper and again, data-driven, talk about some things going on there. And then come up finally with some conclusions and what I see as maybe the key future directions that we, both as a scientific community that I'm part of, but society as a whole needs to be moving towards. And then with time, we'll have some Q&A, and I always tell my students, all questions are good questions. Bring it on. We're totally, very much would encourage some Q&A at the end. So, okay. Let's start off with just some basics on cannabis. Most of us know about cannabis in the year 2021, living in California. Hard to imagine that anyone wouldn't. But just to remind ourselves of the cannabis plant, there are two basic species or subspecies, Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica. There are multiple molecules in any plant, of course, but within the cannabis plant, we have these molecules called cannabinoids. I'll come back to talk about this, but these are the molecules of interest when we talk about the cannabis plant. Now, you might notice that I'm not using the word marijuana. You might, I'm not using the word weed or anything like that. Really, when you get specific, marijuana refers to the dried leaves and flowers of the cannabis plant. Cannabis is a more broadly encompassing term, especially when we talk about products derived from the cannabis plant. There are other forms of compounds that come from the cannabis plant, hashish, which is a concentrated form, and as we'll see, many, many derived products that are quite readily available right here in this community. By the way, I have no disclosures to make, and when I go to professional meetings, no disclosures from the cannabis industry or anything else, so don't worry there. Just to remind everybody, cannabis is still a Schedule I regulated drug at the federal level. So we live in a state where the state laws changed and it is legal by state regulation, but we'll see that varies, of course, still from state to state. Consumption of cannabis, of course, we'll talk a little about that, but traditionally in rolled cigarettes or pipes, many different oral preparations that are out there. And potency, another issue we'll touch on, varies a lot depending on the strain of the plant, depending on growing conditions and how it's prepared. So let's talk about the history a little bit. Like I say, I call this a selected history because I could have probably devoted the whole hour to the history part of it. But just to give you some highlights of the history of cannabis. So if you go way back to 2900, so what is that, 5,000 something years ago, we have the earliest noted use by Emperor Fuxi of China of the use of the cannabis plant. Go to Egypt in the age of the New Kingdom, 1500. We have a medical reference in the Ebers Papyrus. Really interesting. Within that papyrus, the hieroglyphics have been discerned to reference the cannabis plant. for medicinal purposes, right? Moving forward to ancient Greece, we have reference to it there, here on a Greek urn, the cannabis leaf, right? Marijuana leaf on an urn. I'm jumping quite a lot of centuries very quickly, but if we go up into more somewhat modern times, we're here in the 17th century. Here's an English reference to cannabis being tried for mental health in a book called The Anatomy of Melancholy by Demetrius Jr., whoever he was. Medicinal cannabis by the 19th century becomes widely available and widely used in the West, and you see this advertised. Even none other than Queen Victoria was a proponent of cannabis products in her day. Didn't include that one there. Now, as we move to the 20th century, we get to this turning point where about the year 1900, in the first decade of the 20th century, we begin to see a lot of restriction on all kinds of pharmaceuticals. And so that first 30 years, there's a movement to begin to restrict marijuana and cannabis in general and its availability. And so jumping into the 20th century, a real landmark here is in 1930, Harry Anslinger becomes the head of what's then called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And that is when cannabis and marijuana becomes very, very much criminalized, very much restricted. And so even pharmaceutical companies, drugstores, nobody can really access it, beginning at that point in the 1930s. And as we move through the mid-20th century, we begin to see more and more of a perception of marijuana along the lines of this, right? I kind of thought it was funny that they have all this and they show needles where I don't know where they got that from, but I thought this one was interesting. Kind of a what do they call those dime store, cheap dime novels from whatever. Marijuana Girl here. So, along this way, though, in the 20th century, we begin to see the science of cannabis really taking off. And interestingly, 1940, cannabidiol, one of those cannabinoids, is first synthesized, identified and synthesized. We'll refer to that as CBD. The other one, in 1964, shown here, its molecular structure, tetrahydrocannabinol, is discovered in 1964, identified and synthesized. So we're beginning to really get the science of this going much later on the historical timeline. And then we move to the latter part of the 20th century, we begin to see the medical marijuana movement, which we're certainly familiar with here in California. So by the time we get to the 80s and 90s, a movement to decriminalize, make marijuana available for medicinal purposes. Along the way, neuroscientists discover the receptor in our bodies for the naturally occurring compounds that cannabis mimics, cannabis products mimic. This is known as the cannabinoid receptor, 1990. You can see there are two main types of it. We'll come back to that later. And in 1992, the body's natural, or what we call in neuroscience, endogenous cannabinoid is discovered. The body's own form of cannabinoid that's produced in the brain called anandamide, and several others are discovered subsequently. So now we're into the 21st century. We're in this era of growing, even past decriminalization and extensive legalization, not only in the United States, but in other countries as well. So all you have to do is take a peek around, in our own culture right now, and we're living in the cannabis age, right? It's been popularized, big name stars are using it. It's certainly in our media, it's even in kids' games. And of course, there's the whole economic perspective of it. We sit in the county where, so much of this is now being grown in what used to be, we were talking earlier about, there used to be orchid farms right now, converted over into cannabis production. So we have this, real shift going on. We're in the midst of it, and I think those trends are continuing. Just to give you a sense, I think many of you may be familiar with this, but if you go and look at what cannabis products are there today, I'll tell you, this ain't my high school days. I grew up in Northern California in the late 70s, and actually was a very high level of cannabis use at that time, but we certainly didn't have this kind of stuff being marketed at the time. So the more traditional, or the more well-characterized use of cannabis is from the plant and the various buds that form the top parts of that plant, either smoked through pipes or cigarettes. But the number, as I was doing some background research, I was just overwhelmed at the plethora, there's the variety, the creativity of the American capitalist system when it comes to cannabis. Just so much out there. I mean, we've got cannabis cocktails, we've got cannabis beverages, every kind of chocolate you can imagine, built into a cannabis product. So we're in the midst of this, right? And this is only continuing to progress that way. So where are we at as far as the use patterns? Well, if you look, this is very recent. This is 2021 data from procon.org, good organization if you want data. You can see out west, we've really gone pretty much to pretty heavy legalization of both medicinal and recreational use, and I think that map will continue to color in as the years go by, right? If we look at the pattern of just drug use, and again, it is a federal Scheduled 1 drug, so it is still illegal by federal standards. So if you look at just the pattern of use, marijuana far and away is used more than any other illicit substance. That's worldwide. I'm just showing you United States statistics here. So you can see just right here, this is data from 2018, not too long ago, an estimate of about 43.4 million regular users of cannabis in the United States, and that certainly continues to edge up. Just to give you a little bit of the kind of trends here, so this is data from SAMHSA, that's the mental health, government mental health organization. Looking in the first part of the 21st century, you can see what's really striking to me in this figure is the old folks here that are my generation, right? Kind of the right here, really ratcheting up in terms of percentage use. Right here is the adolescent age, staying fairly stable in these years, but let me give you a little update here. Okay, I found this figure takes us up to 2017. Jump ahead. This is the most recent data I could get, and we've been stymied because of COVID on collecting data for the last couple of years. This is about as recent as we have that I could find. You notice here, this is showing the percent of the population that are past month users. That's a good statistic, right? And what we're seeing now is we're seeing an ever increasing number. These are the raw numbers here in the over 25 population. Of course, the 18 to 25 makes up the largest percentage of users. But in all these categories, you can see a steady incline going up here. Not massive, but every year plodding ahead, right? Kind of a little more. And I think that is a trend we'll very likely see going forward in the future, right? Okay, so cannabinoids, I introduced that term earlier. These are the molecules of interest when we talk about the cannabis plant. We refer to them as a shorthand CB. The word endocannabinoid refers to the body's own cannabinoid system. We have a God-given endocannabinoid system. It's fascinating. There's a lot that's being studied about it. We still don't even know all of what it does. But the cannabinoids are just any class of molecule either that the body produces or a plant produces that act on this system in both the brain and the rest of the body. The two best known cannabinoids, I've already introduced those to you, are CBD and THC from the cannabis plant. These are molecules from the cannabis plant, cannabidiol, tetrahydrocannabinol. Just interesting from my chemistry background, I always find it fascinating to look at molecular structure. I'm not going to give you a lecture on chemistry, but you don't have to be a chemist just to notice, don't those things look kind of similar, Dr. C? They do. They're very similar. In fact, the only difference is right in that one little part of the molecular structure. We have what's called a hydroxyl group right there, and this is a bonded oxygen molecule right there. Very similar, but very, very different as we're going to see in terms of their impact and effects, okay? By the way, there are now over 100 of these plant-derived cannabinoids that have been discovered, but we really don't know much about these. There's a whole area that we still are just beginning to understand about what might be happening in this field we call exogenous or phytocannabinoids. Okay, another, to me, very interesting stat right here. If you look at this, what this is showing is the percent of THC, okay, that's in red right here, and the percent of CBD. All right, the two molecules of interest here. Doesn't take much of a statistical background to figure out what's going on here, right? Here we are just at the end of the 20th century, and if I drew that line out to when I was in high school, you're probably down looking at, I don't know if you can see the numbers in the back, but that's 3.96 right there. You're probably looking at well under 1% THC in your average cannabis. Less than 1% back in the 70s and 80s. This, by the way, comes from DEA, so this is real true samplings, wherever they capture out there in the open world, right? But notice what's happening. The level of THC is skyrocketed. We're up in levels now that are phenomenally higher than they used to be. And at the same time, CBD is either staying the same or even somewhat going down in terms of its the average content. So interesting stat, we'll come back to that. So, whoa, come on in. Let me tell you a little about cannabinoids in the brain. So stay with me here. We're going to talk a little about some brain function. So put on your thinking caps and think about cannabinoids in the brain. So I mentioned already that the brain has these receptor sites for its natural cannabinoids. We have these proteins that bond to molecules like that one I told you called anandamide. They kind of bind to it and have an effect. The two main ones, as I mentioned already, are CB1 and CB2. Now, for me as a neuroscientist, CB1 gets my attention. It's the one expressed very heavily in the brain. It's also found in the periphery. CB2 turns out to be much more involved in immune function. So there's actually differences between these two types of receptors, and we're still figuring all this out. But like any other psychoactive drug, I could be talking about amphetamine, I could talk about heroin, I could talk about cocaine, you name it, right? All the biggies. They mimic something in our brains. They do something to act like what our brain has, okay? THC, and CBD for that matter, but THC activates neurons because its chemical structure somehow has some similarities to a naturally occurring compound. Right here, here's that molecule THC. Here's that molecule that's natural to the body called anandamide. You notice very similar, acting on this brain system, okay? The problem is, though, is when we use exogenous chemicals, that is, things that are produced outside of our bodies, sometimes they'll hijack or kind of override the naturally occurring compounds, right? And that's where it gets, for me as a psychopharmacologist, gets interesting, because I'm trying to figure out how does that molecule coming from somewhere else affect what I've got here, you know, the molecules that are naturally occurring to the body. So I'm gonna give you a little basic neurochemistry right here, so you can kind of see what goes on when that THC gets into the brain. So in your brain, you have neurons, which are your basic nerve cells that communicate to each other through gaps called synapses. They're just connection points. And we have these neurochemicals we call neurotransmitters that are being released all the time. What happens when a cannabinoid enters into this system, this brain activity, this synapse? Our nerve terminals express those receptors, in this case CB1 receptors. Those are proteins found naturally. When a drug comes in, here's our little THC molecules floating around, like the logo for our THC there. When those come in, whether it's the body's own cannabinoid or something from a plant like THC, it's going to bind to these receptors, and what it does is it kind of chokes off the activity of that neuron. It kind of reduces the amount of neurochemical being released and really kind of basically inhibits what's the braking system. You can maybe think of it that way. So normally this system is kind of regulated. GABA is a neurochemical that's what we call an inhibitor. It tends to kind of slow things down, keep things under control. The CB1 activation leads to a reduced inhibition, and one of the things it does is it takes your dopamine levels up to a higher level. Now, some of you may have heard of dopamine. Some people call it the reward molecule, the feel-good molecule, and it actually is involved in the rewarding process of our brain. And one of the things that THC does, and one of the reasons people like it, is because it tweaks the dopamine. It activates the dopamine system, and this is the basic way that happens, okay? So these chemical, the THC is mimicking, but in a beyond the normal physiology kind of way, activating the system, leading to changes like this. Now hold your breath. I'm going to show you another slide here. Don't get too taken aback. The complexity of it all. Now this is where when I give these kind of slides to my students, I see the eyes pop open wide. Don't worry about the details. Don't get lost in the details here with me. I just want to, the take-home message here is that this thing is way more complex than any of us thought even 10 years ago. This is a recent review I read about when it came out in 2018. I went back and reread it. Just to give you a sense of how complicated this is turning out to be, it turns out these endocannabinoids, these naturally occurring endocannabinoids, they're not only produced by the nerve cells, they're produced by other cells in the brain called glia cells. And these were always like the supporting cast of hundreds or thousands that everyone ignored for a long time. Turns out these endocannabinoids get kicked out by other cells in the brain. Not only that, they're acting in places 5 or 6 years ago, we didn't even know they were acting. So the point of this is that the complexity is truly amazing, and it's turning out the endocannabinoid arguably maybe the most complex neural regulation system that we possess, even more than the ones we've characterized for many years. So, okay, I'm going to get you out of the neurochemistry here, take you to the brain, okay? Let's just talk a little about just general effects on brain when cannabis is used, when the exogenous, when something like marijuana is smoked, whatever. So this really just summarizes some brain areas that have particular impact from cannabis products, things like THC, CBD. So I'm just going to point out a couple. That euphoria, that relaxation, the reason people like to use it, it's not too complicated, it's, well, it is complicated, but at one level it's pretty simple. Either you use it to feel better, right, or you use it to get rid of a bad feeling, right, kind of the two sides of the coin. Much of that is happening in a place called the ventral striatum. There are things like we call it orexogenic, or the appetite-enhancing effects. That's through an area called the hypothalamus. So we know that where cannabis is acting in a general sense. One thing I wanted to point out in this picture, and you can read the rest of these yourself, but I wanted to point out this area, the hippocampus, because I am going to be showing you data soon here of the impact of marijuana specifically on this part of the brain, the hippocampus, which we know is extremely important in our declarative learning and memory process. That's facts, figures, places, memories. So we're going to talk about that. But just so you know, cannabis is very widespread in terms of its general effects across the brain. And we begin to understand where that's having an effect at the conscious and behavioral level. So, okay. That's a good point to ask a question. I'm going to take a little breather here, and local Montecito resident there. We'll take a little break, and I'll entertain a couple of questions. We'll have lots of time for Q&A at the end, but please, yes, question. Yeah.
Is the impaired intended to be just during the experience that the brain is enjoying that, or is it a longer term?
That is a great question. Yes, both. What we find is that there are certainly acute effects that can disrupt certain memory processing, like a working memory task. But we now know with heavy cannabis use, and I'll come to this later, with heavy cannabis use, you can have effects that can last certainly past cessation or past the use time of the compound. Yeah, a good point. Maybe I'll entertain one more question. Yeah. Great question. I always tell, so when I teach my students about neuroscience, no transmitter acts on its own. And so we absolutely know that it definitely modulates serotonin function, oxytocin. I'd pretty much almost go to the level of saying that any of the neurotransmitter systems we've characterized over the many decades are impacted or modulated through endocannabinoid signaling. Without going into too much detail, it turns out that the G protein, which is the cannabinoid receptor is what's called a G protein and has a linkage, it turns out to be even that is expressed differently depending on the transmitter system it's interacting with. So yeah, good point. Maybe one more there, and then I'm going to try and save these for the end because I have to be aware of the time here. But please, yes. Yeah, great question. Again, we're still exploring that. We know that the endocannabinoids turn out to be important in modulating our learning process, the natural learning process. They certainly are involved in things like appetitive regulation, so as you might imagine, appetite. So our natural endocannabinoid signaling, when it's functioning correctly, is going to modulate our appetite in the way we would hope. There's evidence in the area of sleep cycles and waking that endocannabinoids seem to regulate. Again, the field is amazing in terms of the diversity of functions we're finding for these endocannabinoids, and much of their role, in some ways, is almost like modulatory, kind of setting the gain in some ways, perhaps, for some of the other neurotransmitter systems that have been characterized in those domains.
These areas have all been affected by...
Absolutely, yeah. It's, if I was to show you, I don't have a picture, if I showed you a brain image that just showed you mapping out these cannabinoid receptors, they're just all over. They're more dense in some areas. For example, they're very dense in what we call the neocortex. Less so in some other areas that are subcortical, but you can pretty much find these things very widely distributed. So, hold on to the questions. We'll have a lot of time for Q&A later. I do want to be just cognizant of the time. So we're going to talk now about health effects. Okay, so that's kind of the background on a little neurochemistry, a little bit of brain function. Big report. This is almost a 500-page report. You can check it out from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, our premier body of experts in 2017. This came out on the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids, and a really seminal finding that summarized pretty much everything that the field knew up to that point. And there's not, this is pretty recent, so it's pretty good. And what I'm going to pull out of this, it's a 500-page report. There's a lot to say. I'm going to give you a little snapshot of some of the findings here. Okay, just a little snapshot. So people always ask, what has come out of cannabis that has therapeutic benefit, right? So we have substantial evidence for improving chronic pain in adults, nausea, we call that antiemetic effect, if someone's nauseated or vomiting, especially for chemo-induced nausea, and spasticity, that's muscle dysregulation in a condition called multiple sclerosis, MS. Moderate evidence, not as strong, but there's still some evidence for short-term sleep problems in various conditions. We have limited, but still some evidence for improving anorexia and weight loss in HIV/AIDS patients, social anxiety, thought that was interesting, and Tourette's syndrome, which is a neurological tic disorder. One thing I want to point out, and it's kind of ironic, we're in the middle of an old ophthalmologist office here, if I found out today. The evidence, people often tell me, one of the things you often hear is like, oh yeah, smoke some weed, it's good for your glaucoma. That is absolutely not true. We can talk to my wife later, she's an eye doctor, she's right here in the front. But that's one of the areas that it really, there's not good evidence. Dementia, people have argued for it there. Depression, no, there's not evidence. There's limited evidence, in fact, for the opposite, that it doesn't improve, just the opposite. Anything else, all other indications, at this point, there is insufficient evidence for therapeutic benefits. And I'm talking as a scientist. I'm just saying that the data so far doesn't mean that there won't be, we won't find that, but to date, this is kind of a basic summary of that. I'm going to go a little deeper on some of these. There's a couple things I didn't mention here, but that's kind of an overview from the National Academy, very current kind of stuff. Let me give you a couple of pictures of this where we do see the medical benefits. One is from a really good, this is very recent meta-analysis. That's kind of a big, won't get into what a meta-analysis is, a big systematic review. What they did was they wanted to see the benefits and harms of medical cannabis and cannabinoids for chronic pain. So they basically collected all the data that's out there up to January of this year. It's about as hot off the press as you get for a review paper. They looked at all randomized clinical trials, and you can see what they looked at for chronic pain conditions. Here's their conclusions. So with moderate to high certainty, non-inhaled, so they're focusing on consumable medical cannabis and cannabinoids, results in small to very small but significant improvements in pain relief, physical function, and sleep quality among patients with chronic pain. So that's the kind of level of evidence we have. Is it helping? Yes. Is it the panacea we often hear? Maybe not, right? We'll talk about that. Let me give you one other area where there has been some, what I think, good solid evidence for a cannabinoid having a benefit, therapeutic benefit. And that's CBD. Remember, that's cannabidiol. CBD for certain types of seizure disorders. You may or may not know, but the CBD does not have the psychoactive properties of the THC. It's the THC that gets you high, right? That's the one that really changes the sensorial perception and the, kind of the weird effects, right? CBD, interestingly, they've done studies on this in early childhood onset epilepsy conditions. The names of these are Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome. They've shown that adjunctive CBD as a treatment effectively reduces seizure incidence. And it turns out, interestingly enough, those anti-seizure properties aren't even mediated through the cannabinoid receptor. This is how complicated this is getting, but through other alternate pathways. So in 2018, the FDA approved CBD. It's marketed as Epidiolex. And this is solid data. This is good. This is really pretty solid therapeutic benefit. And there are ongoing studies now to explore this for adult-level seizure disorders. We don't know in adults yet if this is holding, the data is holding, but that's where we're heading. And I want to make a point here that with CBD, I think there is the potential, you notice I underlined potential, as in we haven't quite figured it out yet, but there is a potential because of its possible anti-inflammatory, neuroprotective, and antioxidant properties. So potential is there, and there's a lot of research kind of heading in that direction. What else with cannabis do we have available? Well, you may have heard of this one. This goes back quite a ways, actually, called dronabinol. It's marketed as Marinol. This came out way back in 1985. It was a form of THC that got rescheduled. It's been rescheduled down to Schedule 3, which is a much lesser restricted category. It's used for nausea and as an appetite stimulant, particularly for people undergoing chemotherapy. It helps. It's not a cure-all, but it is used for that. There's a drug in the UK called nabiximols. It's branded as Sativex. It's a spray, interestingly enough. It's kind of a spray form. It's limited use for spasticity and pain in the UK. And then nabilone is the only other one. That's a synthetic cannabinoid that's also used for nausea and as a pain relief medication. Those are the other ones that have been approved and available, again, with some limited use in the clinic. So I'm going to kind of move into the other side of cannabis, and that's really what are some of the concerns we have as neuroscientists and certainly in the medical field. when I got this talk together, I thought, well, I spent a lot of my life studying addiction, substance use disorders, and I'm really not going to talk a whole lot about the substance use disorder end of things. We can discuss that later in the discussion. I'm going to really focus on brain and brain health quite a lot more, and mental health. But I did want to point out that cannabis use disorder is a recognized clinical condition. There are treatment centers for it. I have good psychiatry colleagues who treat people with what's called CUD. And these are just some basic numbers from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, that about 9% of people that are consistent users of cannabis will go on to develop at some point some form of a dependency. Right? We use the word, we don't use addiction as much now, but a cannabis use disorder. What is concerning, and this is a point I'm going to come back to, if you look at those that start at an early age, before the age of 17, and that are really heavy users, that incidence rises dramatically. The incidence of cannabis use disorder is much more pronounced in someone who's starting to do that in their 30s, right, or 40s. So that's about, I'm just going to cover that on CUD. I do want to just point out a few of the health concerns that really, if we just kind of target them and think about them, I'm not going to get into details here, but we certainly know that prenatally, cannabis is completely contraindicated. There's a lot of concern that people are thinking, well, it's cannabis, it's weed, it can't be too bad. But there is definitely evidence that it's got some prenatal effects we need to be worried about. I'm going to return to this one, that the use in adolescence is related with an increased risk of psychosis and suicidal behavior. The use among adolescents is linked to a decline in IQ. Again, correlative, most of that, but it is there. Development of other substance use disorders, including alcohol, tobacco, and other illicit drugs. That comes out of the NASEM report. So the use of cannabis kind of goes back to the old gateway theory. And there is some evidence that there's a pattern of usage that can develop into other substances. There's an example of the risk of prescription opioid use increases in those that reported cannabis use 5 years earlier. So maybe a predictor of abusing another type of substance. And then finally, I found this interesting, just found this one in my literature search, 1.5 million ER visits, this is data from 2019, so pretty recent data, as a result of cannabis consumption per year in the US. And this is all ages, right? This is, this would include, the accidental overdose that a child might have from eating mom and dad's, cannabis gummy worms or something, to people that come in with panic attacks, to all kinds of things. So I was actually surprised at those numbers. I was higher than I would have thought. Okay, let me tell you a little about the brain and cannabis, okay? So I told you about the hippocampus already, and the fact that it's very important for our learning and memory process. And so in diseases like Alzheimer's disease, that area is very heavily impacted. So it turns out in many studies that have studied this is just a section of a human brain that kind of highlighted the area called the hippocampus and the amygdala, color-coded right there. They've done this has been replicated now by several groups. I'm showing you some of the earlier work. So Yusul and colleagues in 2008 showed that if you measure the hippocampus and the amygdala in cannabis users versus controls, there's a significant decrease in the literal volume. They actually measure the amount of the hippocampus, the size of the hippocampus, in chronic cannabis users. This has been replicated now by many. Here's a more recent study by Lorenzetti and their colleagues. Same kind of finding, hippocampus in the cannabis users, volumetric change, amygdala, same thing, volumetric change in a decreased manner. This has also been, some of these studies, been linked to impaired memory performance, which we know is a key part of healthy hippocampus function. So that's one thing we do know. I came across a study, as I was getting ready for this talk, by that same group I mentioned earlier, one of the key cannabis researchers out there, Yusul and their colleagues. And I wanted to point this one out because it's intriguing to me as we talk about THC versus CBD. The title of the paper is Hippocampal Harms, Protection and Recovery Following Regular Cannabis Use. So let me tell you what they did in this study. They took regular cannabis users and non-using controls, and they broke the cannabis users into subgroups. And it was really brilliant how they did this. Because what they did was they took both urine samples and hair samples. And by doing that, they could figure out, especially from the hair sample, people that had almost exclusively THC use and almost non-existent CBD or vice versa. So they actually came up with these separate groups. And then what they did, they measured using MRI, that's a brain imaging technique, just to look at the volume of the brain. They looked at the hippocampal integrity to see what's going on in these different populations. People that use CBD alone, people that use THC alone, or people that are using both. Okay, so you see the groups here. And then they had, as well, they had a group that had been long-term abstinent. So people that had stopped using cannabis, maybe getting into your question a little, had not used cannabis for, I don't remember the duration, but it was at least a year. So this next figure is a little intimidating, but just walk with me on it. Oh, not this, but the next figure. Base finding, so they replicated that smaller hippocampal volume. That's a replication of many studies so far. But here's what they found. So again, there's a little bit of all kinds of stuff going on here, but what I'm going to point you to is this bottom figure right here. This is kind of a statistical analysis of the actual data. And what they found was, if you can see in the back there, it says THC alone, that group that's color-coded green, that was the group that had been using THC long-term without the presence of CBD. It was the THC alone. If you notice the groups here, they actually broke it into one group. They weren't sure how much CBD they had, another group where they could measure the CBD, kind of the two CBD groups. They did not significantly differ from the controls on those volume measures. Now, they look like it, but the statistics would show us that they're not significantly different. And the former users had returned more or less back to baseline. They were very similar to the controls. So the take-home message, here's your take-home message on this, is that yes, cannabis use can harm brain health. It looks like maybe it's underpinned by the THC exposure, and that CBD may, if anything, actually have a protective effect against the THC. That's not totally out of the realm of what we know from the neurochemistry, because these two molecules do counteract each other from a molecular sense, the way they act in the brain at times. So I just found that really interesting, this kind of balancing the THC and the CBD. Okay. We're going to turn to mental health, and this is going to kind of bring us into the home stretch here. So you with me so far? So that's really looking at the brain health, looking particularly at this area called the hippocampus. And it's not the only area that's been studied, but one that's been particularly well supported by the data, right? Data-driven. Let me tell you about mental health and cannabis. So this is not, this actually, I actually was thinking about showing you a clip from Reefer Madness at the start of this, but I thought, nah, maybe not. Go look it up on YouTube if you've never seen it before. But what we've seen, and this is a finding that goes back many decades, but it's been more and more replicated, is that there seems to be an association with particularly early heavy cannabis use and the onset of different forms of psychosis. Now, by psychosis, I'm talking about things like delusional thinking, paranoid ideation, things that you might see in someone diagnosed with schizophrenia, for example. This was a big study. It came out of Sweden, Andreasen and their group. What they found was they looked at these conscripts, the number of times cannabis had been used, and the cases per thousand of schizophrenia developing, and they saw a relationship with use patterns in these conscripts. These are young men, right? Sweden in the 1980s. Similar kind of finding from 2002, British Medical Journal. If you look at the risk of schizophrenia-like psychosis at age 26, cannabis users by age 18, it's increased somewhat. You'd think one is pretty much matches the population. If that cannabis use had happened earlier, you substantially increase the odds of seeing psychosis develop at that later age. So again, very key to this is the time and development of that exposure, that use, and the amount of use as well. Let me show you another piece of more recent data. I was really blown away by this. I saw this at a conference, pre-COVID conference. Marta Di Forti, great cannabis researcher over in Europe. She has these multi-centers all over Europe. You may not be able to see the graph in the back, but I'll just tell you the take-home on this. Here's the title of this talk: The Contribution of Cannabis Use to Variation in the Incidence of Psychotic Disorder Across Europe. This is a mind-blowing experiment. So they had multi-sites. They're measuring, basically they went in and they looked at the adjusted psychosis incidence in the population, so shown on this here, and then they looked at the prevalence of daily cannabis use in the population. Just kind of how much cannabis is out there, how much is being used. So this top one here is just cannabis in general. This is high potency cannabis. And again, you don't have to be a statistician to see what's going on there. There's this incredible overlay. And what's striking about the overlay, this is London, Cambridge, Amsterdam, Madrid, Barcelona, Bologna, Palermo. This is going across Europe and measuring the amount of cannabis use relating it to the incident psychosis. Now it's correlational, but very intriguing given the amount of subjects they employed in doing this study. So here's the take-home from Marta Di Forti. Differences in frequency of daily cannabis use and the use of high-potency cannabis contributed to the striking variation in the incidence of psychotic disorder across the 11 studied sites. By the way, they had a Brazilian site in there too, just as it wasn't just European phenomena. But in any case, very interesting data, I thought. So let me walk you through what we are looking at right now as far as early life impact. So instead of just showing you lots of data, in the interest of time, I'm going to highlight some take-homes that I've seen in the most recent reviews. So I found the most cutting edge, most recent data on this, and I've highlighted just a few points of it. So again, in those under 25, higher cannabis use, adverse psychological symptoms. Repeated cannabis, this is from another review, harmful neurocognitive effects that persist into adulthood. Adolescent onset linked with cognitive impairments, including poorer academic vocational outcomes. We haven't touched on that much. And a greater incidence of psychological disorders. Tirada Munoza found that, this I want to point out a little more detail. The word preclinical means basic neuroscience, studying it in non-human subjects. We have really wonderful models in animals to study the cause-effect relationship of what happens to the brain during development. Almost every single one of those studies indicates that or early exposure to cannabis is disrupting behavioral and neural function at a later date. And this again, it comes from the kind of studies where you can get at that cause-effect relationship. And then finally, one of the most recent reviews I found just a couple weeks ago, just came out from Debenham and all, found persisting deficits in cognitive domains that we look at in neuropsychology that reflect functions of areas like the hippocampus and like the cerebral cortex. So. Okay. Good news, where are we heading with this? One of the things we have going on now is called the ABCD study. Real excited about this. The directors of all these different institutes got together. This is the National Institute on Drug Abuse, Alcohol Abuse, the Cancer Institute, just a whole bunch of National Institutes of Health people. They're doing this massive study. I think it's actually up to 14 or 15,000 now. And they're doing this over 10 years, looking at all measures of brain development. They're doing MRI scans. They're doing all kinds of behavioral measures. And one of the things they're really focusing on is cannabis effects. So I think we're going to be seeing some really good data coming out soon from this ABCD study. So if you're interested, there's the link to that. Check it out. That's going to really help us. It's going to give us much more of an understanding from what we call a prospective sense of where things are going. So, all right. Well, let me take us home with some conclusions then, and we'll have some Q&A time after that. So. Obviously, we're in a position where cannabis use is growing worldwide. The legalization patterns are increasing in other countries outside of North America, and we don't see that really going the opposite way at this point. Cannabis-derived substances, I'll say it clearly, have some therapeutic benefits. There's no question, right? There obviously is therapeutic benefits. But I would say a lot of the potential beneficial uses are yet to be determined. And my message to you, living in a cannabis-saturated South Coast area, be very careful with the kind of claims you hear made from people that are selling cannabis products. They're selling those cannabis products to make a profit, of course, right? But I just want you to be aware of that. And I tell my students to use what we call amiable skepticism. Means not in-your-face skepticism. You can be nice about it, but put on that skeptic's perspective, right, with those kind of claims. I think we can say with the data I've shown you here, and with a lot of data I didn't have time for, that heavy cannabis use, especially turning out this high THC to CBD ratio, has significant risk factors for brain health. I think people in my field of neuroscience, there's really no debate on this. It's a question maybe of magnitude and a lot of questions about it, but it seems to be clear. And this one, cannabis use in childhood and adolescence has particularly higher long-term risk to health. This, for example, this increased risk of psychosis, which we've seen much evidence for. So where does that put us in terms of where do we go with this? Where do we move forward with this kind of stuff? What are our directions to go? Well, as a good scientist, I'm always arguing for more studies. Keeps us in business, But we do. We really need to, one of the striking things about cannabis, back, probably about, a little over 10 years ago, I was in my heyday of doing a lot of drug addiction research, and we were studying the heavy hitters. We had methamphetamine, we had cocaine, we had heroin, we even had alcohol and nicotine, but we weren't studying cannabis. And it's really striking how little cannabis research had actually been going on until really the last decade, in terms of really good research. So I think we need better studies, more perspective, and I've underlined that cause-effect relationship. A lot of the data I've shown you is correlative, and as a scientist, we always have to be careful when we infer cause-effect relationships. The growing evidence is pushing us towards cause-effect and seeing that cause-effect, but I just want to emphasize that. Good studies, good science, right? More controlled assessment of the clinical utility. I told you there are now over 100 of these cannabinoids that we've discovered from the cannabis plant. We have no idea what they're doing. It's like when we talk about the tobacco plant. We have no idea what everything in there is doing, and it would be really useful. There may be hidden gems. There may be stuff in there that could have therapeutic potential, but we'll need to see where that goes with good research. And so that kind of relates to this one too. Clear the path of different profile cannabinoids. That's both the ones that come from the plant as well as understanding more. One of the questions that came up was, what does our endogenous system do? We still don't completely understand that. Tapping into the endogenous endocannabinoid system may have great benefit. And then finally, I want to finish off with this statement here. One thing that I get concerned about as a scientist and just as a member of society, right, is that I think we're kind of tipping the scales on our spectrum, right? When the U.S. entered that phase in the 1930s and 40s, it was all about the reefer madness, right? It was just, oh my gosh, you're gonna go kill somebody if you smoke a joint. I think we're actually moving a little bit too far in the opposite way. And what I mean by that is, I think our risk awareness and our understanding of the risk is diluting down to a point where we're really kind of moving beyond what the evidence would tell us. And so I think the concern is that there's a lot of news out there, well, cannabis isn't as bad, it's not as bad as alcohol, it's not, we can talk about comparisons, but yes, there are risks, and I think particularly in that developing stage of life. We know from the brain that the brain is so sensitive in the developmental phases. Your brain, did you know that the brain actually doesn't fully mature in the way we would think of maturation until you're in really your mid-20s, and if you're a certain young male, that may not happen until much later. Okay guys, I'm just giving you a hard time there, but it's true. It is, yeah, it actually is true. But the issue here is that the brain is so susceptible to so many factors in terms of the environment. I think we're doing a great disservice to message children and adolescents, particularly adolescents, even young adults, college-age students, that it's not that bad for you, because it really could be. I mean, and I think we need to be careful of our messaging on that. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you for your attendance, and ask if there's any questions. I did tell you I'd give you a little up in smoke right there. So. Not to glorify things, but question. Yeah.
So my question has to do with in research that's going to go forward and research that's already just recently happening. You had one slide where you pointed out that long ago it was 1%, and that now that range went from 3.5 to 15 or 20% of concentration of THC in the product.
Yeah.
So if someone takes a cigarette with a 20% content and is doing that regularly for 17 years or whatever, that's going to be different data than if they're smoking 1% pot. And the question would be, are you guys taking that into account? And even some of this, some data said in 1987 tests, and I saw on the screen there, and others are 2019 and stuff.
Yeah.
And they're using pot from the last 5 years or 10 years or 6 years, or it's done.
That's an excellent point, and I think you're very right that we're in this kind of moving target phase. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was basically, how do we deal with this fact that the THC content has risen dramatically over the last decade, certainly the last 15, 20 years, and yet we're sitting on data that sometimes goes back to the 1980s. I think what it does call for, we really have to really generate the right kind of studies now in the face of that higher potency weed.
Follow-up question is, where can you get the 1% stuff?
Yeah, right. Well, you can imagine the growers aren't really interested in the 1% stuff. That's the other thing we're dealing with. Very, very sophisticated botany here. I'm not a plant person, but we're dealing with some, very, obviously profit motivated, very sophisticated ability to cultivate the kind of plants that do yield THC that was unheard of, 20 or 30 years ago. Yeah, thank you. Question right there, and then next, yeah.
Can you speak about the neurobiological effects of breathing secondhand smoke?
Good question. Yeah, so the question was about secondhand smoke. I actually looked into that a little bit. You'd be surprised, there's not a lot of really good data on it. Nowhere near as much data as we have for tobacco products. We definitely know tobacco has been well established. Secondhand smoke is dangerous in many ways. We can presume based on physics, just understanding vaporization, that if you measure the vaporized content, that there are THC molecules in there, that's no doubt. We just don't really have good data on it, to be honest. There's not been good studies looking at the secondhand smoke. I think the general rule of thumb, of course, is one wouldn't want to be exposed to an enclosed area with heavy smoke if they're trying to avoid THC exposure. And I do think it speaks again to the issue of, well, who's in your household, right? I mean, do you have young children at home? I mean, if you're smoking weed and you're like, it's not bad for me, I'm 35 or 40, but you have people that might be exposed to that. I think it's a big concern. Unfortunately, we just don't really have, that I could find, really good data at this point. Great question. Yes, question there, and then right behind you. Yeah, with the hat.
What is the half-life consistency of people that are, typical users of marijuana, and then does that continuously carry into the mental effects of the brain?
So the question is the half-life of terms of how long they're using, or?
How long it lasts in your system.
Oh, in the system. So the question is how long does the THC or any cannabinoid persist? And so I'll answer that one first, and then remind me of the second half. It is very what we call lipophilic. It's fat-loving, and so it persists depending on it. It's always the amount of how much did you use, for how long did you use it. But you can measure levels of it for weeks, if you have a very sensitive assay. So it can persist quite a while. The actual biological effect really dissipates fairly, much more rapidly than that. So someone who's used it and then a week later, you really couldn't discern, kind of psychoactive. They're not walking around feeling like they just smoked a joint, but there are detectable levels, certainly after that. What was the second half that you asked?
Well, the second half correlated to that, in that can that still affect the brain in different motor functions?
Good question. Yeah. So you wouldn't have, so if someone has used cannabis, there are immediate effects of the drug, like, for example, I didn't even talk about this, but motor coordination, right? The reason we don't want people getting high and driving on the 101 is because it disrupts motor coordination, not surprisingly. That would be something that would be fairly acute. So if someone smoked marijuana and then the next day got on the freeway, they're probably not going to have any persisting effects of that acute exposure to THC. Does that kind of answer it?
Yeah, but also, does it carry over into the way that you think, the memory, all that?
That, for sure. The heavy use, we do see that persisting effect. You actually raise a good point. So on that one study I showed you where they had the abstinence users and the hippocampal volume look fairly much like controls, that still doesn't mean that their memory function is completely normative, that they may still have, and we do have evidence that people will continue to show really that's a functional issue that goes beyond just what the structure is telling us, because the brain is not just about how much brain you have, but how you use it. So, but those are good questions. Thanks. There was one, Bert, right behind you, and then a fellow in the glasses there. Yeah.
Does cannabis smoking promote lung cancer and emphysema like tobacco?
Yeah, there is some evidence that it definitely will exacerbate, certainly bronchitis and kind of lung irritation. I didn't really do a lot of background research on the cancer issue, and so I'm really not an expert on it. I really don't know what the data says on the cancer issue. I didn't come across anything that had really solid evidence. There had been some people touting it for cancer treatment, but I think people conflate that with using it for chemotherapy-induced nausea, and that's a whole different issue. But I'm not. Maybe someone else knows the data on the cancer. I'm not familiar with that data. You had a question there, and then next to you on that side there.
Cannabis is basically a delivery vehicle for cannabinoids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, other than being synthetically produced, is there any other source of cannabinoids?
Good question. Like beyond the cannabis plant. I've not come across in terms of plants. Maybe someone else would know this, but I'm not familiar with anything. You do have, the two types of cannabis, sativa and indica, and there's another one, I forget the name, it's cannabis, starts with an R, can't remember the name. But to my knowledge, I don't think the cannabinoids, at least the ones we recognize like THC and CBD, I don't think they're found in other plants, to my knowledge. I mean, I may be wrong on that. And then, of course, the synthetic cannabinoids is a very hot area right now. There are actually startup companies that are beginning to develop synthetic cannabinoids for therapeutic use, and even companies that have already been doing that, pharmaceutical companies. But beyond that, I'm not aware of it. Yeah. Got a question?
What about the effects on people that
Yeah. So the question is the difference between oral consumption, eating it, versus smoking it. Well, certainly in the eating, if you're eating a product, you're not exposing your lungs to those things we just talked about, right? Any kind of bronchitis-like effects. The evidence to date, one thing to say about that is the oral consumption has risen dramatically with legalization. So we're still at a stage where we don't really know the full story, because historically, if you look over the decades, it's primarily been smoked. I mean, reefers and pipes and bongs and all that kind of thing. So to date, we still are trying to discern the difference between what that might look like orally. I would say it's maybe not even the consumption route, but the amount that one does. So if you were consuming large amounts orally, that would probably push you down that same road that if you were using large amounts of the smoke product as well, particularly the THC, as we were noting before. But again, I think that's a point that we're really going to have to look at new research as oral cannabis products are just so much more widely available just in this last decade. We don't have a ton of data on that. So there was. Let me go with someone who hasn't asked a question yet, right there.
Have you seen anything about topicals? Is there any data on topical use?
Yeah, topical use. I didn't really look into that. Good question. So the question was about the topical use, and you're seeing this with a lot of CBD products, for example. I did run across something that was some evidence for some benefit as an anti-inflammatory. People are saying that CBD may have anti-inflammatory properties. I wouldn't be able to quote you data on that, so I'm a little hesitant to say yes or no. I've seen that in the literature reviews, but I'm not sure how solid the data is on that. Certainly, it doesn't seem. The one thing with the CBD products, is one of those things where, the adage in medicine is first do no harm, right? And it appears that CBD, for many of its current uses, is not inducing, the harmful effects that one would see with THC. But I'm not sure what the data tells us on that. So. In the back there, and then we'll come to the front. Yeah, you're right there. Yeah. Sorry, just a second. Let this guy go by for a second. That's the disadvantage of a nice patio, right? Okay, go for it.
Hear anything about the potential positive effects of it on anxiety? It seems like a lot of people with anxiety take it, but the reason I ask that is you show a lot of data, and I bet a lot of people think that it's causing that weed or THC is causing those things that's been correlated. And is it not possible that there's a common cause of people in adolescence who gravitate towards pot with anxiety that are likely to develop psychosis?
Great question. And so the question was, is it very likely that people that might develop these psychological conditions are already kind of moving that direction, and they're maybe using it as to deal with a problem or whatever. So that gets back to that core issue of cause-effect relationships, right? So many of the early studies were very correlational, right? Looking at the incidence and just reporting it. What we're seeing now is there are studies that have been coming out in the last decade that are getting at the cause effect. And that's why I point out that ABCD study, because that'll truly help us get at that cause and effect. So far, and I'm summarizing here a lot of recent data, and particularly some of the more neurobiologically oriented studies that look at brain function in the preclinical realm. Those are definitely pointing to some cause-effect relationship. Does not rule out that other side of the coin can happen as well. I liken it more to, there's something called the diaesthesis stress model we talk about in psychiatry and neuroscience. And it's like, you may have a genetic, we all have genetic predispositions for all kinds of things. But what path you go down for that, and what you're exposed to in the environment, your context, your family life, your social life, how many drinks you had, whatever, all of that can push you in one direction or another. And so I liken it a little bit, particularly for people that might have, perhaps in their family, a familial risk for psychosis. It's a little bit of Russian roulette almost, right? That if you perhaps have a family history of mental illness, heavy use of cannabis is very likely to push you down that pathway in a much more pronounced way than you see otherwise. But we still have to really work at that cause-effect relationship, certainly. Good point. Yeah.
Is there any evidence for it actually helping with anxiety?
Okay, yeah, the other question about helping with anxiety. Going back to the NASEM study, which I think is probably the most comprehensive, that's the National Academy study I referenced earlier. The only thing I saw that came out of the NASEM study, and they were collating across lots of studies, social anxiety was the one that seemed to help out. So And I didn't use that before I gave my talk today, but you might think maybe the person a little stage fright, maybe this guy, so that's the one. The social anxiety is an interesting phenomenon. It's not a generalized anxiety, it's not a panic disorder, but it's more of a context dependent. That is the one area where there's some limited evidence for improvement. Yeah. Not in the others, no. Yeah, exactly. So for example, there's no indication that you'd be wanting to use cannabis for panic disorder. If anything, it's probably contraindicated. So, good point. We had one up here. How are we doing on time? I just want to be sensitive to people's time here. We good for another one? 6:40. 6:40. We could know. Okay, yes.
I just wanted to ask another thing that's interesting and probably not yet studied. It took forever to figure out that not only is tobacco bad for us, but that the chemicals they use when they put it together in the package with, and the chemicals that
Like
go in
formaldehyde?
the paper and the filters and all that are bad. Well, now these edibles that we're talking about, in the old days, people cooked marijuana and got it into butter or something like that. Because it's favorable, like you said, whatever.
Yeah.
But nowadays, there's all these products that you just showed the pictures, and nobody's really studying how do they make those products.
Yeah.
And what are they mixing it with, and what chemicals are in there?
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
is something that I don't want to have to wait, or people shouldn't have to wait, 50 years to find out later that they killed you with that. If they had just
Yeah.
given you the real stuff, it would have been fine.
Yeah.
They killed you with the way they put these little chemicals in these.
Yeah.
things together.
So it's just the general question is that what about the additional components that get into this marketing? And you raise a good point. We really don't know. It's it's like so many of these things. Depending on how that's regulated and what goes into it. So maybe we'll do one more question, and then I'll be hanging out here if anyone wants to come up and chat afterwards. But yes.
Mine kind of piggybacks off of his. Have there been any studies about the effects that happen to people from the spraying of cannabis, because it is sprayed very commonly
Sure.
for
Sure.
bugs, and
Yeah.
how that affects people?
Yeah, so the question of like not fungicide, we call it pesticide, right? Just things that would be involved in it. Interesting little side story. Years ago, this is back in my UCLA days. This is a long time ago. My PhD thesis was in the area of antipsychotic drugs, but I got really interested in a drug called MPTP, which is a neurotoxin that can actually wipe out a certain type of dopamine neuron in the brain. And one of the things at that time that people got interested in was that they were spraying fields in Mexico with what was called paraquat, which is a pesticide that would kill the plants. And there was some speculation of, well, that chemical had some similarities to this drug called MPTP that we were studying in the neuroscience lab. And there was speculation about, well, could there be an interplay that pesticide may mimic this neurotoxin and affect people along those lines. Now, the bottom line was we never saw really systematic evidence for that. Doesn't rule out, that there could have been some contribution to that, but it would make one concerned about, again, it kind of relates to the point made over here about you better know where that product's from, but yeah, good point. So I'm going to stop there just really quickly. If you want to take a snapshot of that, these are some nice sources. The NASEM report is that one right there, and just a few other things. But thank you all so much for coming to our Westmont downtown, and I hope you come to future ones. So.
Well, he stole my line. I just wanted to say thank you to Ron. This was great. So thank you very much. And thank you for coming out. We look forward to seeing you again as we talk about things that matter downtown. So we now have a facility here and over there, and we'll just look for ads that we have for conversations that will be upcoming in the months ahead. Thank you for coming out.